When we talk about Egypt, most people imagine the pyramids of Giza, the golden mask of Tutankhamun, or the silent watch of the Sphinx standing against the desert wind. But Egypt's story is far greater than monuments and mysteries. It's not just the tale of pharaohs or tombs, it's the story of human civilization itself. And when you start to peel back the layers, when you look beneath the sand in the centuries, you begin to see that Egypt is not a relic of the past, it's the heartbeat of our shared human story. Egypt's legacy begins more than 5,000 years ago, long before the Greeks, before Rome, before the world knew the word empire, along the Nile River. But civilization rose not out of war or conquest, but out of water, rhythm, and time. The Nile was their lifeline. Every year, it flooded and withdrew, bringing with it fertile soil enough to feed generations. From that cycle, Egypt learned something the rest of the world hadn't yet grasped, that the key to civilization was balance, not domination, balance between nature and people, between gods and kings, between life and death. It's strange to think, but when those early Egyptians looked at their world, they didn't separate the spiritual from the practical. To build a city was also to honor the divine, to farm, to write, to rule. Each was a sacred act, and that unity gave them stability for thousands of years. While other societies rose and fell in chaos, Egypt remained a steady flame burning through the darkness of prehistory. Now, when I say Egypt invented civilization, that's not a figure of speech. They created one of the first centralized governments, organized labor, taxation, and trade. They developed mathematics, engineering, astronomy, and one of the world's first writing systems, hieroglyphics. Imagine that a people who could look at the stars tracked the flooding of the Nile and translate it all into symbols carved in stone so their descendants could remember. That's not just intelligence, that's vision. That's legacy. We often forget that Egypt was the world's first superpower. And it wasn't just about military might, it was about influence, cultural, spiritual, artistic. Pharaohs like Djoser and Khufu weren't just kings, they were living gods. Their monuments weren't vanity projects, they were statements of permanence. We're here, they said, what mattered. And 5,000 years later, we're still listening. But Egypt's genius wasn't just in its rulers. It was in its people. The builders, the scribes, the farmers who understood that to sustain greatness, you need more than power. You need order. You need belief. You need purpose. The ancient Egyptians built more than pyramids. They built systems of law, of religion, of education that would outlast dynasties. And that's why when other empires vanished, Egypt adapted. It endured. Now, history likes to focus on the famous names: Tutankhamun, Ramses the Great, Cleopatra, but the truth is, Egypt's story is not one of individuals. It's one of continuity. For 3,000 years, through invasions, droughts, rebellions, and reforms, Egypt remained Egypt. Its language, its gods, its art, evolving but never breaking. That's not just resilience, that's identity. You know, there's a quiet kind of wisdom in how Egyptians viewed time. To them, the past wasn't gone. It lived alongside the present. The soul could journey through death and return in eternity. The pharaohs built tombs not as endings, but as gateways. Every pyramid, every temple was a conversation between the living and the dead, a reminder that legacy doesn't end. When life does, it transforms. And as I reflect on that, I think there's something deeply human about Egypt's obsession with immortality. We all want to leave something behind, something that says, I was here, I mattered. For Egypt, that something became stone and story. And through those stories, they taught the world how to remember. But here's the part most people don't know. Egypt's greatness didn't just belong to its kings or its priests. It belonged to its scholars. In the city of Thebes, in the temples of Karnak and Luxor, priests studied the movements of the stars. In Memphis, engineers mapped irrigation canals that kept the desert alive. In Heliopolis, thinkers debated the meaning of creation itself long before Socrates or Aristotle. Egypt was a university of the world. Knowledge wasn't hoarded, it was sacred. And that spirit of inquiry, that belief in reason and order, would one day shape Greece, Rome, and every civilization that followed. By the time the pyramids of Giza were already ancient, the rest of the world was still learning to write. That's how far ahead Egypt was. And yet, despite all their achievements, the Egyptians never saw themselves as masters of nature. They saw themselves as part of it. They didn't just build along the Nile, they listened to it. They let it teach them patience, discipline, rhythm. And maybe that's why their civilization lasted longer than any in human history, because they understood something we often forget: progress without harmony doesn't last. As centuries passed, Egypt changed, slowly, steadily. Dynasties rose and fell. Gods gained and lost followers. Foreigners arrived: Nubians, Libyans, Assyrians, Persians. Each left their mark. Each tried to claim Egypt. But Egypt absorbed them all. The conquerors became the conquered, shaped by the land, the river, and the memory of greatness too old to erase. And so, as we close this first chapter of Egypt's story, I want you to remember this: Egypt was not just a kingdom. It was a lesson in endurance, in wisdom, in what it means to build something that outlives you. It reminds us that civilization is not measured by wealth or conquest, but by what we leave behind for our children and their children after them. Because, in the end, the sands of time don't bury truth. They preserve it. And in those sands, Egypt left behind not ruins, but reminders that greatness begins not with power, but with purpose. When we left Egypt's early story, it was already the envy of the ancient world, a civilization defined by order, by rhythm, by the eternal pulse of the Nile. But as the centuries moved forward, Egypt began to change. The old kingdom, the age of the great pyramids, faded. The unity that had built the might of the pharaohs began to fracture. And with that fracture came something Egypt had never truly faced before: uncertainty. Now, uncertainty is a powerful teacher. It exposes weakness, tests endurance, and asks a civilization to remember what it stands for. For Egypt, those years between the Old and Middle Kingdoms were a time of reckoning. The government collapsed, the economy struggled, local leaders fought for control, famine came, and with it, desperation. Yet out of that chaos, Egypt did what few civilizations could do. It rebirthed itself. The Middle Kingdom emerged like the Nile after a drought, steady, life-giving, wiser for the hardship it had endured. New rulers from Thebes brought order back to the land. They understood that leadership wasn't just about power, but about service, about restoring faith in something larger than any one man. They rebuilt canals, reopened trade routes, and renewed temples. They revived the idea that Egypt was not just a country, but a sacred trust. And here's what's remarkable: while much of the world still struggled to organize itself, Egypt had already entered an age of humanism. Its literature flourished. Scribes wrote poems and moral teachings, reflections on justice, truth, and humility. They spoke of ma'at, a word that meant more than balance or law. It meant cosmic order, harmony, the rightness of all things. That idea, that societies endure only when guided by justice, that's something as relevant today as it was 4,000 years ago. But no nation stays still for long. As the Middle Kingdom aged, Egypt's wealth and ambition grew, and with it, new challenges. Eventually, foreign invaders, the Hyksos, came from the east. They brought new weapons, new technologies, and a new kind of warfare. For the first time, Egypt found itself under foreign rule. That's something the people of the Nile had never known, to be conquered on their own soil. It could have been the end of their story, but Egypt did what Egypt always did. It adapted. It learned from its conquerors, adopted their innovations, and when the time was right, it rose again. The princes of Thebes, led by Ahmose-I, reclaimed their homeland. And with that victory came a new age, the new kingdom, Egypt's golden era. Now, when you hear names like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, and Nefertiti, Ramses the Great, that's the new kingdom. This was when Egypt became an empire, stretching from the Sudan in the south to Syria in the north. It was powerful, wealthy, and confident. But it was also curious. Egyptian ships sailed the Red Sea, trading with distant lands. Diplomats negotiated with Babylon and Hatti. Soldiers marched beyond the deserts they once feared. The world had changed, and Egypt was leading it. And yet, what truly defined this era wasn't just conquest, it was expression. Look at the temples of Luxor, the Valley of the Kings, the art, the music, the language. Everything carried the mark of a people deeply aware of their place in the world. They didn't just build for themselves, they built for eternity. One of the most remarkable figures of this period was Hatshepsut, a woman who ruled as pharaoh. Think about that. In an age when kingship was divine, Hatshepsut wore the beard, took the throne, and led her people with intelligence and vision. She expanded trade, built monuments, and brought prosperity without waging endless war. She understood what true leadership meant, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Then came Akhenaten, the heretic king, a visionary to some, a radical to others. He tried to rewrite Egypt's religion replacing centuries of tradition with the worship of a single god, Aten, the sun disk. He moved the capital, built new temples, and declared a revolution of faith. For a brief moment, Egypt was monotheistic, a world first, but revolutions rarely end cleanly. After his death, his reforms crumbled, his city abandoned, his own son, Tutankhamun, restored the old gods and erased Akhenaten's name from history. Yet, even in failure, Akhenaten left behind an idea that truth might not always fit inside tradition. And then, of course, there was Ramses the Great, the most celebrated of all pharaohs. He ruled for over 60 years, fought wars, built cities, carved his image into cliffs. To his people, he was a living god. To his enemies, a force to be feared. But what truly made Ramses great wasn't his armies. It was his ability to leave a mark so vast that even millennia later, we still speak his name. But behind all the grandeur, Egypt faced new pressures. Power attracts envy and wealth breeds conflict. The empire stretched too far, its borders too wide. The priests grew rich, the nobles restless. Foreign threats loomed again. The sea peoples, mysterious invaders who brought chaos to the Mediterranean. The great temples began to crumble. The once golden age of Egypt dimmed. By the time the new kingdom fell, Egypt was exhausted. The river still flowed, but the unity that had defined the land of the Nile was fading. The Libyans came. The Nubians ruled for a time. Then the Assyrians. Then the Persians. Each wave of conquest stripped away another layer of Egypt's sovereignty until what had once been the master of empires became a prize to be fought over. And yet, even in defeat, Egypt remained Egypt. Its culture endured. Its language adapted. Its people remembered they might bend under foreign rule, but they never broke. That's the part of Egypt most people don't see. The quiet defiance of a civilization that refused to vanish. So, as the curtain closed on the age of the Pharaohs, a new chapter was beginning, one that would bring Egypt into the orbit of Greece, of Rome, of a world that was changing faster than ever before. And through it all, Egypt would continue to remind the world of who had come first, who had shown humanity what it meant to build, to write, to believe. Because even as the crown passed from one conqueror to another, the spirit of Egypt, the wisdom of its river, its temples, its people continue to whisper through time. Empires may rise and fall, but civilization endures. By the time the last of the native pharaohs laid down his crown, Egypt had already lived a dozen lifetimes. It had seen kingdoms rise and crumble. It had buried gods and resurrected them. But now a new wind was blowing across the Mediterranean, a wind carrying the names of Greece and Rome. Egypt, the teacher of the ancient world, was about to become the student. When Alexander the Great marched into Egypt in 332 BCE, there was no great battle, no resistance. The Egyptians, wary of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. They saw in him not just a conqueror, but a man blessed by destiny, a new kind of pharaoh. And in that moment, the world's greatest empire met its most ancient one. Alexander understood something. Few conquerors' dead power wasn't just about force. It was about story. So he did what the pharaohs before him had done. He built. On the edge of the Nile Delta, near the Mediterranean Sea, he founded a city that would bear his name, Alexandria. What he couldn't have known then was that this city would become one of the most extraordinary centers of learning and culture the world has ever seen. After Alexander's death, his generals divided his empire. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of his closest companions. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek ruling class governing an Egyptian land. It was a fusion of two civilizations, Greek intellect and Egyptian tradition. The Ptolemies adopted the rituals of the pharaohs. They built temples to Egyptian gods. They spoke Greek in their courts, but honored the Nile as sacred. It was an age of blending old and new, east and west. But perhaps the greatest symbol of this new Egypt was the Library of Alexandria. Imagine it. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls gathered from across the known world, Persia, India, Greece, Africa, an attempt to capture all human knowledge in one place. It was more than a library. It was a declaration. That learning itself was power. That truth preserved could outlive kingdoms. Scholars from every corner of the world came to study there. Mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine. Alexandria was where the world came to think. And yet, as often happens, greatness draws conflict. Egypt's wealth made it a prize once again. The Ptolemaic rulers fought among themselves. Brothers and sisters betrayed each other for the throne. Intrigue filled the palaces and ambition clouded judgment. The old unity of Egypt began to fracture. just as it had before. And in that storm of politics and power, one woman would emerge whose name would echo for eternity, Cleopatra. Now, most people think they know Cleopatra, the seductress, the queen who ensnared Caesar and Mark Antony. But that's the Hollywood version. The truth is far more complex and far more fascinating. Cleopatra, though, was brilliant, fluent in multiple languages. Educated in philosophy, astronomy, and diplomacy, she wasn't just beautiful, she was strategic. She understood that Egypt's survival depended on navigating the dangerous tides of Rome's ambition. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, Cleopatra didn't bow to him. She negotiated with him. She understood that alliance was her weapon. With Caesar's support, she reclaimed her throne and brought stability to a country on the brink of collapse. After his death, she did it again with Mark Antony. It wasn't romance that defined her, it was survival. She played the game of empires and nearly won. But Egypt's independence was living on borrowed time. Rome was growing stronger, more aggressive, more imperial. When Antony and Cleopatra were defeated by Octavian, later Augustus, the dream of a free Egypt died with them. Cleopatra's suicide in 30 BCE marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the end of 3,000 years of pharaohs. For the first time, Egypt became a province of a foreign empire, Rome's southern jewel. Now, under Roman rule, Egypt remained vital. Its grain fed the empire. Its temple still stood. Its gods, though reinterpreted, survived in new forms. The Romans admired Egypt, even envied it. Emperors like Hadrian and Augustus visited its monuments, inscribing their names on temples built 1,000 years before. But make no mistake, Egypt's sovereignty was gone. Its destiny was now tied to powers beyond its borders. And yet, something remarkable happened during this period. While politically subdued, culturally Egypt remained alive. The old and the new coexisted. The gods of Isis and Osiris found followers even in Rome. Egyptian art, fashion, and mysticism captivated the empire. The allure of Egypt, the sense of mystery, eternity, and spiritual depth was too powerful to erase. Even as foreign governors ruled from Alexandria, the Egyptian soul endured in the hearts of its people. Then came a quieter revolution, one that would reshape not just Egypt, but the world. Christianity began to spread through the Roman world, and Egypt became one of its earliest centers. In Alexandria, scholars debated theology. The desert became home to monks and hermits seeking divine truth. The faith that began in secrecy would soon challenge the empire itself. Egypt, once the cradle of gods, was becoming a cradle of faith. By the time the Roman Empire split and later fell, Egypt was already changing again. The temples to the old gods were closing. The hieroglyphs, once sacred words of power, were slowly forgotten. The Library of Alexandria, symbol of human knowledge, was lost, burned, looted, scattered to history. Some say it was destroyed by Julius Caesar's fire, others blame Christian zeal, still others, centuries later, the Arab conquest. But the truth is simpler. Ignorance and time are the greatest destroyers of all. And so, as Egypt entered the Byzantine era, it stood at a crossroads. The ancient world was dying. The modern world was not yet born. The pyramids still watched over the sands, but their builders' names were fading from memory. And still, the Nile flow, quiet, patient, eternal, carrying Egypt from one age to another. You see, what makes Egypt's story so powerful isn't just its monuments or kins. It's this rhythm of rise and fall, death and rebirth. Every time the world tried to write its end, Egypt began a new chapter. It's as if the land itself refused to be forgotten. And in the centuries to come, as the old empires fell and new faiths took root, Egypt would once again transform. A new language would be heard in its markets. A new religion would shape its cities. And once more, Egypt would stand at the center of the world's attention, not as a relic, but as a bridge between past and future, faith and power, east and west, because Egypt's story, unlike any other, wasn't written in ink. It was written in stone, in sand, in the memory of humanity itself. And no empire, no army, no conqueror has ever been able to erase that. By the dawn of the 7th century, the Egypt of the Pharaohs, of Alexander, of Cleopatra, and Caesar had become a shadow of its old glory. The Byzantine Empire ruled from afar, its officials more interested in taxes than the hearts of the people. The hieroglyphs were forgotten, the old temples closed. Egypt was wary, weighed down by centuries of conquest, corruption, and division, and then out of the deserts of Arabia came a new sound, a call that would change Egypt and the world forever. It wasn't the clash of armies at first, but the whisper of an idea. There is no God but God, a faith built not on kings and monuments, but on unity, equality, and submission to something greater than man. Islam had arrived. When the Arab armies entered Egypt in 6041 CE, led by Amr ibn al-As, they didn't come to destroy the land. They came to renew it. They found a people tired of foreign rule, ready for a new beginning. Alexandria, once the center of Greek wisdom, surrendered without ruin. And in a place called Fustat, near what would one day become Cairo, the first mosque in Africa was built, the Mosque of Amr ibn al-Az. It still stands today, a quiet witness to Egypt's rebirth. Now, for many, this was more than just a change of rulers. It was a transformation of the spirit. The Coptic Christians, Egypt's native believers, continued their faith, but Arabic began to replace Greek and Coptic as the language of trade, of government, of thought. The new rulers respected Egypt's farmers, its scholars, its engineers. They revived the canals, the markets, the culture, and slowly that ancient teacher of civilization became the beating heart of the Islamic world. As centuries passed, Egypt flourished under new dynasties. The Umayyads gave way to the Abbasids, and with each change, Egypt remained central, the bridge between Africa, the Mediterranean, and the East. But it was under the Fatimids, beginning in 969 CE, that Egypt entered a new golden age. From their hands rose a city that would rival Baghdad, Jerusalem. Al-Damascus, Kara, the victorious. It wasn't just a capital, it was a statement. A city of power, beauty, and intellect. Its mosques shimmered with gold. Its markets overflowed with spices and silk. And at its heart stood a university unlike any other, Al-Azhar, founded in 972. For over 1,000 years, Al-Azhar has stood as the spiritual and intellectual center of Islam. Scholars from every land came to learn here. From Morocco to India, from the Ottoman courts to the deserts of Arabia. It became what the Library of Alexandria once was, a sanctuary for thought. Now, Egypt wasn't without turmoil. The Crusades came. The Mongols burned their way across Asia. Empires clashed in the Holy Land, and through it all, Egypt remained unbroken. When the Crusaders threatened Islam's heart, Egypt answered, and leading that defense was one of history's most remarkable figures, Salah ad-Din, or as the West called him, Saladin. Saladin was an Egyptian by birth, but he became its protector in spirit. He united Egypt and Syria, drove back the Crusaders, and recaptured Jerusalem, not through slaughter, but through mercy. Even his enemies respected him. He rebuilt Cairo, strengthened Egypt, and restored dignity to a land too often used by foreign powers. To this day, his name stands for honor, a leader who fought fiercely, but ruled with restraint. Under his dynasty, the Ayyubids, Egypt prospered again. But soon, new hands would shape its destiny. The Mamluks, they were soldiers, slaves from distant lands, brought to serve the sultans. But in one of history's great twists, they rose to become rulers themselves for nearly 3 centuries. These warrior kings of Turkish and Circassian origin defended Egypt from every threat that came. When the Mongols destroyed Baghdad in 1258, it was Egypt under the Mamluks that saved the heart of the Islamic world. They defeated the Mongol army at Ain Jalut in 1260, the first time that unstoppable empire had been broken. The victory echoed across continents. Egypt became the last stronghold of civilization in an age of chaos. And yet, for all their might, the Mamluks weren't mere conquerors. They built. The Cairo they left behind, the domes, the minarets, the madrasas, remains one of the most beautiful cities on earth. They filled its skyline with the same devotion the Pharaohs once carved into stone. Different faith, same drive to leave behind something that would outlast them. By the 14th century, travelers like Ibn Battuta and Ibn Khaldun wrote of Cairo as a wonder, a city of 1,000 mosques, a hub of trade connecting Africa, Europe, and Asia. Even as plagues and famine struck, Egypt's resilience never faded. The Nile still flowed, and where there was water, there was life. But time once again began to turn. The world beyond Egypt was shifting. The Ottomans were rising in the north. Gunpowder was changing warfare. Trade routes were moving to the seas. The Mamluks, proud and powerful, couldn't see that the world was evolving beyond their control. In 1517, the Ottoman Empire arrived. Sultan Selimid defeated the Mamluks, and Egypt became a province, no longer a sovereign state, but a jewel in another man's crown. And yet again, Egypt adapted. Under Ottoman rule, its scholars continued to teach. Its merchants continued to trade. Cairo remained a city of life, of faith, of meaning. But something deeper was happening. The old rhythms that had carried Egypt through millennia, the flow of the Nile, the cycles of power and renewal were beginning to strain under the weight of the modern world. Egypt's history had always been about endurance. But now, it would have to learn to survive in a world of empires that no longer sought wisdom, only wealth. And still, through every conquest, through every flag raised and lowered, the Egyptian people kept something no ruler could ever take: their sense of identity, their memory, their pride in being the descendants of a civilization older than history itself. That's the part people forget. Egypt never stopped being Egypt. Whether under pharaohs or sultans, under caliphs or kings, it remained the crossroads of the world, where Africa meets Asia, where faith meets reason, where history refuses to die, because every empire that ruled Egypt eventually realized the same truth: you can govern its land, you can command its armies, but you can never possess its soul. By the dawn of the 18th century, Egypt had been living under Ottoman rule for nearly 300 years. The old glories of the Pharaohs, the Fatimids, and the Mamluks had faded into memory. The Nile still flowed, but the world had changed. Europe was entering an age of science, discovery, and empire, while Egypt was trapped between nostalgia and neglect. The once great heart of civilization had become a forgotten province. But history has a way of circling back, and when it does, it rarely asks for permission. In 1798, a young general from France arrived on Egypt's shores. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and with him came not just soldiers, but scientists, engineers, and artists, the savants who would forever change how the world saw Egypt. Napoleon didn't just want to conquer the land, he wanted to understand it. He studied its temples, its monuments, its people. He measured the pyramids, mapped the deserts, and took the first steps toward what we now call Egyptology. It's ironic, in a way. The French came as invaders, but they awakened the world to Egypt's greatness. The description Dialogue Gept, the monumental study they produced, reminded Europe that before their revolutions, before their empires, there had been Egypt. That the wisdom they sought in books had once been carved in stone by the banks of the Nile. But Napoleon's conquest didn't last. The British, the Ottomans, and the Egyptians themselves resisted fiercely. Within 3 years, the French were gone. Yet Egypt would never be the same. The old Ottoman order had been shaken, and from the chaos rose a man who would reshape Egypt's destiny, a man named Muhammad Ali. He wasn't Egyptian by birth. He was an Albanian officer in the Ottoman army. But he was ambitious, visionary, and ruthless in equal measure. Through cunning and force, he seized control in 1805 and became the founder of modern Egypt. What followed was one of the most dramatic transformations in the country's history. Muhammad Ali understood something that few before him had grasped, but Egypt could no longer live in the past. It had to modernize or be swallowed whole by the new world taken shape beyond its borders. So he built schools, factories, and shipyards. He reorganized the army, trained by Europeans, armed with new weapons. He sent students to Paris to study science and engineering. He introduced industrial reforms and expanded agriculture, especially cotton, which would become the backbone of Egypt's economy. But progress has its price. To fund his vision, he taxed the peasants heavily and conscripted them into labor. The brilliance of his reforms was matched by their brutality. Still, his ambition was undeniable. He dreamed of an empire, not just an independent Egypt, but a power that could rival Europe. For a time, he nearly succeeded. His armies conquered Sudan, threatened Syria, and even challenged the Ottoman Sultan himself. But the great powers, Britain, France, and Russia, had other plans. They couldn't allow a strong Egypt to upset their delicate balance. So through diplomacy and force, they cut Muhammad Ali down to size. He remained ruler of Egypt, but his dream of empire was over. Yet in the ruins of that dream, a modern state had been born. Under his descendants, the modernization continued. Railways, telegraphs, universities, and printing presses arrived. Cairo expanded, new cities rose, and the Suez Canal, completed in 1869, opened Egypt to the world once more. It was a marvel of engineering, a lifeline between East and West. But it also became a trap, because with every foreign investment came foreign influence. The British and the French saw Egypt not as a nation reborn, but as a prize to be managed, debt mounted, and by the 1880s, Egypt had fallen under British occupation. Officially, it was still part of the Ottoman Empire. In reality, it was ruled from London. The cradle of civilization had become a colony. Now, it's easy to look back and see only oppression. But Egypt's story is never that simple. Under occupation, a new kind of Egyptian identity began to form, one that wasn't just about faith or dynasty, but about nationhood. Educated Egyptians, inspired by Western ideas yet rooted in their own heritage, began to ask, what does it mean to be Egyptian? Not as subjects, but as citizens. Out of that question came reformers like Rafal al-Tatawi, who championed education and modernization, and Muhammad Abdu, who sought to reconcile Islam with reason, faith with progress. They weren't just thinkers, they were bridge builders between worlds. They believed Egypt could embrace modernity without losing its soul. But change once again brought conflict. The 20th century dawned with Egypt restless under foreign control. The British promised reform but delivered exploitation. Nationalism grew. Protests erupted. In 1919, Egyptians from every walk of life, Muslims, Christians, men, women, rose together in revolution. It was a moment unlike any other in the Arab world. They marched not for a king or a caliph, but for freedom. Their cry was simple: Egypt for the Egyptians. That revolution forced Britain to recognize Egypt's independence in 1922. But it was independence in name only. The British kept control of the Suez Canal, of the army, of Egypt's foreign policy. The monarchy that followed, led by King Fahd and later King Pharaohs, became a symbol of compromise, trapped between national pride and foreign power. Still, Egypt was awakening. Its cities grew vibrant with art, literature, and political debate. Cairo became the cultural capital of the Arab world. Musicians like Kulthum, writers like Taha Hussein, thinkers like Hassan al-Banna and Huda Sha'irawi each shaped a new vision of what Egypt could be. But beneath the surface, tension simmered, poverty deepened, corruption spread. And then came 1948, the creation of Israel and the first Arab-Israeli war. Egypt's army, still under British influence, was humiliated. For many young Egyptians, that defeat shattered any illusion of independence. Among them were a group of military officers who believed that Egypt's destiny had been stolen by kings and colonizers alike. They called themselves the Free Officers, and in 1952, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, they staged a coup that ended the monarchy for good. And just like that, after 3,000 years of kingdoms, dynasties, and empires, Egypt entered a new age, the age of the Republic. It was an end, yes, but also a beginning. The old Egypt of pharaohs and sultans had finally given way to something new, a modern nation, fighting to define itself in a world that still underestimated it. Because Egypt's story, as it turned out, was far from over, it was simply changing form, once again. When the Free Officers took power in 1952, Egypt stood on the edge of a new chapter. The monarchy was gone, the British were losing their grip, and the people, after centuries of submission, could finally imagine a country governed by its own will. Yet what followed was not just a political shift. It was a profound redefinition of identity, of purpose, of what it meant to be Egyptian in the modern age. At the heart of this transformation stood Gamal Abdel Nasser. A young colonel with piercing eyes and a quiet conviction, Nasser became the voice of a generation tired of humiliation. He spoke not only to Egyptians, but to Arabs everywhere. To the colonized, the oppressed, the forgotten, his message was simple but electrifying: dignity. Egypt, he said, would no longer bow. In 1956, Nasser made that message unmistakably clear. When he nationalized the Suez Canal, he took back control of what had long been the symbol of foreign domination. The canal, built by Egyptians, owned by foreigners, was now Egypt's once more. The world reacted with fury. Britain, France, and Israel invaded. But this time, Egypt didn't stand alone. The United States and the Soviet Union, rivals in every other arena, both pressured the invaders to withdraw, and they did. For the first time in modern history, Egypt had defied the old empires and won. Across Africa, across Asia, across the Arab world, people saw Nasser not just as a leader, but as a symbol of resistance and renewal. He spoke of Arab unity, of socialism, of progress rooted in independence. Under his rule, Egypt built factories, schools, and new cities. Land reforms sought to lift peasants from poverty. The Aswan High Dam rose from the desert as a monument to human will, taming the Nile and powering a new age. But no revolution comes without cost. The promise of unity was challenged by reality. The dream of prosperity met the limits of bureaucracy and control. And in 1967, when Egypt went to war with Israel, once again, that dream shattered in 6 days. The defeat was swift, devastating, and humiliating. The Sinai Peninsula was lost. Nasser, the man who had given a nation its pride, now faced a grief that mirrored the country's own. Yet even in failure, Nasser's legacy endured. He had restored a sense of ownership to the Egyptian people, a belief that they were authors of their own destiny. And when he died in 1970, Millions poured into the streets. They mourned not just a man, but an era of conviction. His successor, Anwar-Sadat, inherited a nation wary of war and wary of promises. Sadat was different, calmer, more pragmatic, more attuned to the shifting tides of the world. He knew Egypt could not live forever in conflict. And so in 1973, when he launched a surprise attack on Israeli forces in the Sinai during the Yom Kippur War, it was not simply an act of aggression, it was a calculated statement. Egypt could fight, Egypt could bleed, and Egypt could reclaim its dignity. That war, though costly, restored Egypt's pride. It also opened a door. Sadat used that moment of strength to do what few thought possible. He pursued peace. In 1977, he did the unthinkable. He traveled to Jerusalem. Before the Israeli parliament, he spoke of reconciliation. It was a gesture that stunned the world, and it laid the foundation for the Camp David Accords, brokered 2 years later with President Jimmy Carter. The treaty that followed, in 1979, made Egypt the first Arab nation to officially recognize Israel. It ended decades of war, returned the Sinai to Egyptian control, and won Sadat the Nobel Peace Prize. But peace, too, comes with a price. Many in the Arab world saw the treaty as betrayal. Isolation followed. And at home, in 1981, during a military parade, Anwar-Sadat was assassinated by extremists from within his own army. The man who had made peace with his enemies was killed by his own countrymen. His death was tragic, but his courage, his willingness to challenge history itself, left a mark that endures to this day. After Sadat came Hosni Mubarak, a cautious former Air Force commander who would rule for nearly 3 decades. His tenure was marked by stability on the surface. Egypt remained a cornerstone of American diplomacy, a bridge between East and West, peace and conflict. The economy opened to the world, tourism flourished, and cities grew. But beneath that veneer of calm lay frustration. Political freedoms were limited, corruption festered, the gap between rich and poor widened. For the ordinary Egyptian, life became a balancing act between endurance and hope. The same people who had once built pyramids and canals were now navigating bureaucracy and stagnation. Yet their patience, as always, was deep, until one day it wasn't. In 2011, as revolutions spread across the Arab world, Egypt rose once more. Millions filled Tahrir Square, demanding change. Their chant, freedom and social justice, echoed the same cry for dignity that had guided every chapter of Egypt's story. For 18 days, the world watched as citizens, young and old, Muslim and Christian, rich and poor, stood shoulder to shoulder, united by something larger than fear. And then Mubarak was gone. For the first time in modern memory, Egypt stood unbound, its future unwritten. But the path forward proved difficult. The years that followed brought instability, conflict, and new forms of control. Leaders came and went. Promises rose and fell. And yet, through it all, one thing remained constant: Egypt's resilience. Today, when you walk through Cairo, past the mosques and markets, the skyscrapers and traffic, you feel that pulse. Beneath the noise, beneath the wear of time, there's a rhythm that has never stopped. It's the same rhythm that built the pyramids, that prayed in the temples of Thebes, that wrote in hieroglyphs and chanted in Arabic. Egypt's identity is not bound to a single ruler or religion. It's the sum of every age it has survived. And here's what people often forget. Egypt is not just ancient history, it is living history. Its people carry 5,000 years of memory, not as a burden, but as a compass. They have seen empire and exile, revolution and renewal. And through it all, they have learned that power fades, monuments crumble. But the spirit of a nation, that quiet insistence on life, endures. When I think of Egypt, I don't just think of the pyramids or the pharaohs. I think of the hands that built them. I think of the farmers along the Nile who still rise with the sun, the students who still dream of a better tomorrow, the artists and scholars who still find light in the cracks of history. Egypt is a reminder that civilization is not measured by what it has, but by what it refuses to lose. And that's why, after all these millennia, Egypt still matters. Because it has seen humanity at its best and at its worst, and it's still here, still standing, still writing the next line in the world's longest story. So the next time we speak of Egypt, let's remember we're not just talking about a country. We're talking about civilization itself, alive, enduring, and ever unfinished.